Okay. Maybe I should have let everybody admit themselves. All right. So thank you all for joining. This is the third quarterly briefing for AI in construction. So we kind of do this for a number of reasons. One of them is this is, in almost 30 years in technology, this is the fastest I've ever seen anything move. So this is an attempt for us to keep everybody else, give you the opportunity to hear about some things, ask some good questions, get some discussion going. In the past, we've gone through what AI even is. We've talked a little bit about what RAG and some of the other ways to use modern generative AI are. I encourage you to check those out from Q4 and then Q3. This time I wanted to get into how to actually use generative AI specifically. So we're not going to be talking about deep learning very much. We're not going to be talking about, hang on a minute. Yep. We're not going to be talking about some of the other things. I wanted to focus very much on prompting because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road for generative AI users. And I think what I'm seeing over and over again is there's a little bit of a gap of knowledge in how this is supposed to work. And I thought it'd be good to go through it. So today, look, this isn't going to be the be all and end all because it's moving very quickly. But what I want to do is give everybody a sense of what this is, how this stuff works, and how to get better at it. So with that, I mean, look, I start where I said I would. Getting what you need from generative AI. How are we making this useful? I'm going to use for the moment as our kind of target of what I'm talking about, ChatGPT. All of that works for our product, SpecGPT, and for other things you're finding out there. So I think there's some general lessons that you're going to be able to learn from this. But also, the key thing here is to really get an intuition for how this type of AI works, because it's really different from normal software. So again, today our big focus is going to be on prompting. I'm happy to say that most of these backgrounds I got to from prompting ChatGPT 4. So, this gives you an idea of what you can get with a mediocre prompt or sometimes a pretty good one. So let's start with what we're even talking about here. So what are we saying people do? I just want to make a point for those that are just on your phone. A lot of this stuff is visual. So you'll be able to watch the video later on YouTube. I'll be posting that all over the place. So back to the point. Why are we using generative AI? So there's three buckets that I want to start with. The truth is there's more than this, but these are a pretty good start. The first one you see people using it for is they want to answer a question. They have something that's a little more than a Google search. And they'd like to know, what's a recipe or what's this or what's that. The next one after that is summarizing things, which is like answering a bunch of questions. Very often when you're summarizing things, you're attaching it to a document or a website or something like that. And the third one is creating things. And we'll get to each of these in turn. And along the way, I'm going to use these use cases as illustrations of different ways of thinking about prompting. And let's start with answering a question. So I've broken this one out into three different buckets. So the simplest, because I want to anchor this in what you already know. So we all know Control F. Half of the industry is using Control F every day, more than half. But then we know Google search is a little more sophisticated. And then there's what we really care about today, which is generative AI when you're asking it to answer a question. And it's worth noting some things about what you're used to now. So when you're answering a question with keyword search, whether it's Control F or just edit search, however you're getting into it, it's a really narrow thing you're looking for. So you're going to get the answer either yes or no if you ask a question, if you put the right word in there. And if you don't, it has absolutely no ability, usually anyway, to help you out. So if you misspell it, you're out of luck. But it'll find everything one by one that you've asked it to go find. So the benefits of keyword search that we're used to is it's very narrow, but you don't need any context. You don't have to tell it anything other than go find me Hue in this, or go find me master format, whatever it is. So the benefit is it's easy, it's fast. You click a button, Control F, off you go. The problem, of course, is you only find exactly what you're looking for. It's one at a time. Again, this is 1990s technology, but it's worth noting some things here, and that is that narrowness comes at the fast and easy comes at a cost, and that is that it's super narrow and it only does what you've asked it to do. In contrast, Google really opened this up by answering an actual question. But what's interesting about this, so I took a screenshot this morning actually, and it'll it's interesting here that it's starting to provide possible additional context for you. So it's saying what's a prompt in an essay, what's a prompt response, so on and so forth, so that you can ask better questions. That speaks to this idea of context. So Google's adding a lot of context. That's why they were always better than everyone else and why they continue to get better, is they automatically add context for you. And context here means, when you ask a question like, I don't know, what's a prompt? On its own, that can mean a lot of things. The more you can narrow down the question, the better answer you're going to get. And Google, as I say, does that. First of all, it often has a personal profile of you. It often knows your location, and it probably has your search history. All of that, it uses its own AI to narrow the problem down. And then you saw before, when they can, they try to add to your search query, again, to make the problem smaller and make your question more pointed and easier to answer. The benefits of that, of course, are it's super convenient. Also, though, in this case, it's a gateway to the web, which is what we really use it for. The issue, of course, is it's not really an answer. It's giving you a connection or a link to an answer, which is, obviously useful. We all use it all day long. But what we found and why ChatGPT has had so much success is we want actual answers usually. We don't want more homework to go find the answer. So that gets us to generative AI. So when you're answering a question with generative AI, there's a lot in here that I want to get through. So you have to do some of what was done for you by Google before. Otherwise, you've got a massive problem and it's a problem question, and it's going to give you an answer that's the best it can think of, but it's probably not what you want. So, the problem to be solved needs to be defined somehow, just reading through this. You not need to give it more information than we typically are. And a lot of why you're here today is to think about how prompts work and how can we quickly write them better to get what we want, so we're not, asking over and over again. If you don't give it the answer, it's going to guess. It might learn about you. OpenAI keeps talking about this, and so I expect it to happen. But for the moment, it doesn't really have a ton of memory. They just launched that yesterday. We don't know quite how that's going to work, but it will learn more and more. But also, what winds up really happening in production, and actually we talked about this with both Blackboiler and Document Crunch, is and we do this at The Link, very often we're adding context that you can't see. So when you're seeing a production product that's doing this, there's often context that's being added for you. So the benefit of all of this, of course, is you get an answer, you don't just get links. The issue, as I mentioned before, is the possibilities are much wider. So you're going to get, I wouldn't say nonsense, but you're going to get answers that are not as good as you want if you don't answer the question or you don't give it the context that it needs. So what that gets us to, and the intuition I'd like you to kind of take away from this, there's a concept of problem space. It's not a new one. It's been around forever. And it basically is thinking about how many possible answers are there. And if you think about the problem space for a keyword search, it's really narrow. It's only what you've just typed. In the case of Google search, the problem space is really what exists on the web that matches what you put in there. In the case of generative AI, it's actually potentially infinite because it's not just what you asked, it's how you asked, how you want it answered, and so on, which again makes context even more important for generative AI than it was for Google search and of course for keyword search. So as you think about what you're asking the model to do, or ChatGPT or the product, keep in mind that anything you can do, and this is going to be a bit of a broken record as I talk through this today, anything you can do to make the problem space smaller, you're going to wind up getting a better answer. And some of the tips and tricks we'll talk about in a couple minutes are exactly doing that. So another way of saying it is shrinking the problem space. So putting this in kind of human terms, we naturally do this, right? When we supply context when we're asked a question. So if I ask a human a question, you're going to make assumptions. We automatically make assumptions so that we can answer the question. Very often we're uncomfortable if a question is sitting there ununderstood. We may not answer it, but if we don't understand it, we often get uncomfortable, and that's kind of a natural reaction. So, what is our history with the questioner? What is the role of the questioner? What's the context of the question? Where are we standing? What process are we in the middle of? All that world knowledge a human brings to any question, and none of that is available to ChatGPT or whatever else it is. So one of the problems I'm seeing over and over again when people are using ChatGPT or any one of these is people are asking questions almost as if they were talking to a human, but there's no way for the computer to know or for the model to know all the things a human would automatically bring to it, point one. And point two, both the model and a human are going to make guesses. The difference is humans are way better at making guesses to supply context that you didn't supply. We do it all day long. We grew up doing it as humans, so we're better at it than models are right now. Over time, we think they'll get better. So this is really your main problem. When you think about what prompting is all about, it's making sure that you're asking the question as if you were talking to a very smart blank slate. So you need to fill in that slate so that the question is smaller and the problem space is smaller, and it's actually solvable. So, just to finish this off, we also make assumptions about what's the right way to answer it. We have our own shortcuts and biases that help us to answer questions when they're not well defined. It's worth just reminding you, AI is not good at this yet. They're not good. It's not good at filling in the blanks, which is why sometimes you might get a really well-written answer that isn't what you were the content isn't what you were looking for. And we've talked about this in earlier sessions as well. One of the problems that generative AI presents to us is, unlike everything else, literally everything else in our life, it can be utterly incompetent and look amazing. Like, you just don't see that elsewhere. You don't see very well formatted, perfectly spelled answers that are just wrong. So one of the problems that a good prompt helps you with is make the problem small enough so the content and the way it's presented are better. So I get to quote Einstein like once every couple of years, but this is the idea: is you want to simplify the problem as much as you can, but obviously you don't want to overdo it. You want to make sure you're including everything you need, and we've got a couple frameworks for that. But first, let's just define what we even mean. We've actually kind of gone through it now, but think about a prompt as a question or instruction to generative AI to produce something. That's what you're doing it for, right? You're asking a question or you're telling it to do something, so it'll give you an answer, it'll summarize something, or it'll create something totally new. So you need to supply the context that a human would bring on their own or would be able to answer. Or, that Google and Facebook would from your profile and all the ad tracking that they do, bless their hearts. An example of what I mean by prompts that probably aren't going to get you what you want because you're acting like you're talking to a human, and I've seen these in the wild, is people looking at something and saying, what's wrong with these specs or with this drawing? The problem is that's an open question that isn't contained in the document itself. So you're asking it about its expertise and knowledge, which it probably doesn't have unless you've trained it to do so. And very often we haven't. So asking an open question about what's wrong or what's missing or whatever, you're probably going to get something. Sometimes it'll tell you, I don't know. Show me everywhere there's flat work. Here's another one that is it's an issue in every industry. We have jargon and we have ways of saying things that may not be the way another part of the industry says them. Definitely the way contractors refer to things, and the way a spec writer, who often are quite particular about the words they use, might be different. You're going to find that in drawings, you're going to find that in contracts as well. So knowing that the words that you're using may be something that we use in vernacular, you got to make sure that you're using the words that would be in that source document or would be out in the world. And the final one, it's a little bit related to that actually, is same thing. Are we calling it cement or are we calling it concrete? So that's a little bit jargon. That's a little bit just how people refer to things. So when we think about prompts, what we want to be able to do is, hang on, actually get to that in a sec. What we want to be able to do is make sure that we're asking a question that is answerable given what the AI has as a resource. We want to avoid asking it questions that are expertise. I'm happy to say to most people on this call, your jobs are safe because right now AI does not have expertise. What it has is the ability to do things with documents and information, and that's what we're talking about today. So when you're asking it a question that is about expertise, unless you have a document that has codified that, which frankly we're doing some of that, but it's not going to be able to answer the question. So a related issue is, what level of question are you asking? So the other thing that we'll see sometimes is people asking questions that go beyond even expertise and are more about experience and intuition. So, it's basing its answers on what the material is referencing, as I say a moment ago. If it has a high level summary, great, it'll reference that. But if you're asking for senior level questions like summarize the coding section, you're going to have to tell it how to summarize it. Maybe giving it an example, which we'll see later. What are the differences between the drawings and the specs? You're going to have to tell it what kinds of differences you mean. Are there scope gaps in the project? That's actually a really hard question for anyone that hasn't been at it for 10 years or so. So you're going to run into issues where you're asking the AI questions that are above its level of operation. I like to say, imagine if you're asking a question that a PM could answer, but a fresh out of school PE couldn't, then you're probably going to have a problem. Unless you've got some document somewhere from that PM that it can refer to, it's often not going to have that level of experience. So I think as products roll out, as people use generative AI more and more, these are some important limitations to keep in mind. The cool thing is, and the reason why I'm really happy so many people are involved in this, it's all moving quite quickly. So some of these differences and some of these limits will loosen a little bit, but I don't know how you're going to put into AI the equivalent of someone's 20 years of experience other than documents. So you're kind of back to the same problem. Now that may change in a year or two, but for this year, here we are. So how do you solve that? I love this thing. Hey, ChatGPT, finish this building. Like that's just, this is probably the 50th time you've seen that. The first thing is specificity. So be clear on what you're asking for. Focus on what's in the source material. So don't ask questions that aren't in the source material to the degree you know. And some of the ways you do that is ask it if there's any mention of the thing you care about. Also, they'll provide context, and we're going to get into this a little more later. But what's the role? What's the extent of what you're asking about? And the best one is when you can provide examples. This isn't always possible, but if you can, pop an example in there. If you're using some of the more modern ChatGPT, or you're using Claude or some of these others, they often allow you to upload something. But just keep in mind that there's a limit to how sophisticated a model's ever going to be, certainly within the time frame we care about. Just like a human, though, as things develop and as they get more and they accumulate more and more information, it will get better. But for the next year, this is a way to think about it: is how do you make the problem smaller? I'm going to keep hammering away at that. But wait, it gets worse. And the thing that people often forget about is people talk about AI as if it's one thing. First of all, even deep learning that you have in Siri or you have in your iPhone is different from generative AI. So that already is different. But even within generative AI, there's a ton of different models out there, and they're all going to behave a little bit differently. This is just I grabbed really quickly, but even OpenAI, they've got like 5 of their own models, and each of them is a little better than the other. And as a result, you're going to get different answers. So it's worth noting that what works in one may not work in another, or you may get a better answer or a worse answer depending on what you're doing. When we upgraded our model, we found that some of the context, we being the link, we found that some of the context we were supplying for an earlier OpenAI model confused the new one, and we had to update it. This is actually straight from, I asked ChatGPT about the differences. And it's worth noting that just from 3.5 to 4, there's big improvements in understanding and generating natural language. And I'll show you some examples of what that means. Really what happens is GPT-4 is going to give you a better answer. It's going to be formatted in a more sophisticated way, and it's going to make stuff up increasingly less. And they keep working on the whole hallucination thing, which we'll get to in a sec. Here's an example you can see of a question. This is the question I asked. So it's actually longer than a lot of people normally do. I try to put some, I made it up completely, by the way. So hopefully nobody's looking up Acme Seal. But this is what happened for 3.5. Identical question you can see that for GPT-4, much more information, much more formatted, just overall higher quality. So this is just a quick example of how the same companies say a lot of the same basic model, but the improved model just gives you a better answer. So as we think about prompts and we think about the model, you're going to see that a couple of problems here. One is models are trained on different data sets. In the case of OpenAI, it's the same data set, just more. Models are or are not connected to the internet. That's a big one because it'll get better answers if it can go find an answer. Models are getting better at reasoning, so they're getting better at helping you to make a better prompt. The model itself might be fine-tuned to answer in a certain way. This is one of the ways that we make them better. The final one, and this is quite relevant to products that you're going to be looking at, whether it's the link or it's, to say Document Crunch or some of the others, is it's going to be referring to documents, what we call a retrieval augmented generation, which again is going to affect how your prompt works. You're definitely going to want to reference it. So that's kind of issue number one, is the models themselves are different and growing. We haven't settled on one big model that everyone's using, and I'm not sure we ever will, although I think that you're going to find things stabilize in a couple of years. There's another point I want everyone to be aware of, because this comes up as we talk about the difference between different types of AI. Is the difference between what we call probabilistic versus deterministic. Now, those are some $10 words. I just don't know how to not sound like I'm defending my PhD here. But the point of probabilistic is that classic software is what we call deterministic, and this is in opposition to that. So Excel, Procore, Chrome, everything is one button, one result. So you tell it what to do, and it goes and does it. The problem space, back to that word, is hyper narrow. It's intentionally hyper narrow because we don't want it to be, we don't want variability. We don't want it to be inconsistent. So when you click a button, there's generally one possible output. In contrast, the way that we make generative AI, it's all about probabilities. So there's masking tokens, not masking. In an earlier presentation, I went through this in more detail. The thing to walk away from this is all AI actually is based on probabilities. What you don't see is that OpenAI and us and others will do things to make it so that the thing that is closest to what it's been trained to think is appropriate is what gets the highest probability, is what you see. But behind the scenes, often there are other results that were lower probability. The reason that matters is, hold on a sec, there we go, is this idea of variability. So on the left-hand side, question one, you get answer one. Question two, you get answer two, so on and so forth. Questions two, here you're going to get a variety of answers that sort of center around what hopefully is the most correct. Even OpenAI will tell you, if you ask their models the same question 10 different times, actually he said 10,000 different times, you're going to get 10,000 different answers. The hope is that they only differ in style and how things are written, and the content is not. But keep an eye on this idea that there's this variation, there's this range of possible answers that a model will give to you. This is why sometimes it'll give you things that aren't quite what you want. The idea here is, as I mentioned before, it's calculating the highest probability for the best answer. The transformers is what I showed you before. They're trained to fill in blanks in sentences. So they're trained to say, what's the most likely best way to fill in this blank? The strength is its ability to create new content based on a probability that it'll be correct. But that means that it's going to answer the same difference. So again, the point of probability is that it differs over time. So what do you do about that? Well, this again is where prompting starts to make a difference. Again, you want to make the problem smaller. So all of you are going to be able to walk away from this saying, oh, make the problem smaller. Giving it context, giving it clear expectations, often taking notes on what works. You can actually create a testing plan. There are tools out there that are very good at this, Galileo being one, but there's a bunch of others that will actually automate and help you organize how to test different prompts. But if it's just you and you're doing it at your desk, create 5 to 10 of these to see what gives you the best answer, and you can start to learn how to write better prompts, especially if it's something you do a lot. Next month, we're going to be talking about automations where you might plug in Zapier and ChatGPT in your email or so on. Here's where you're going to want to try a testing plan to make sure that it's doing what you want without you having to check every time. The other thing that I'm sure a lot of you have discovered is when you get an answer, often you can ask a clarifying question as a follow-up. So one of the habits to get out of is thinking that generative AI is like Google and that you ask it a question, it's one and done. Actually, it very much is built to be a dialogue. So if it doesn't give you quite what you want, you can give it more context. You can say, hey, is that everything? Or things like that. Often very much, I find, especially if you're asking a bigger question, you have to give it a little bit extra time. Often that's by giving it a follow-up question. The hope here is that good prompting tightens your variability. So you go from these big ranges. I didn't change this because I stole it from the internet, but you can see that the ranges get a little bit tighter. That is what prompting is supposed to do, because again, you're making the problem smaller, so the variation compresses as well. One of the things, though, that I hope is a habit that all of us are beginning to get is you can actually use generative AI to use generative AI. It can help you. So I actually said, create an image of workers. Please write a prompt for how to write, for an image of workers pouring concrete on a hot day, right? So it turns around and writes this big prompt for me, which I, of course, turned around and gave right back to the same model. And it gave me this, which isn't bad. So instead of me having to write this much, ChatGPT wrote the prompt for me. So a habit I'd love everybody to get into is actually all of these models are able to help you to use them. There's never been technology like that before. We're using it to use itself. It's very meta, no pun intended. Very cool, and it's going to continue to get better and better at that. So a takeaway from that point is think about generative AI increasingly as a partner. So it's not just a tool that you're throwing questions at, it's a tool that can help you use it. So get used to asking chatbots for help in using chatbots. It only takes an extra 5 seconds, and it'll probably save you a ton of time in messing around with mediocre answers. Actually, the thing is, and a lot of people are doing this now, get used to asking chatbots for help in anything. What I did here just on a whim was said, how do I reinstall Microsoft Teams? And boom, I got it super quick. I think IT teams all over the world are celebrating the fact that they don't have to help people to replug things in. This is just an example that I think as we get more and more comfortable with using these tools, we're going to start to find that a lot of little things that we might have needed to Google and then navigate between all the answers and so on and so forth, we can just ask for and get really quickly. And often, you can get a short version of it, a long version of it, and so on. So that's a habit I'd love everyone on this call to get used to is don't just, the way I like to say it is imagine never having a blank page again. You don't ever have to start from zero. You can always get the ChatGPT or whatever it is you're using, Claude or some of the others, to help you to start. And then from there, you can make tweaks as you see fit. So back to our general list of things. We've talked a little bit about answering the question and picked up some ideas about prompting a moment ago. Now I want to talk about, what about summarizing? And there's really two ways that I've seen people summarize things. The first one is you're just asking general knowledge. So that's going to be things that the model itself knows, or maybe it goes and searches the internet. Then there's document-based, where you've uploaded something, or you're using retrieval augmented generation. So problem one, everybody's aware of, hallucinations. It'll fill in the blank when it doesn't know. Happily, that's getting better and better. The models themselves are getting better and better at asking, what was the source? Did you just make that up? A lot of that happens behind the scenes. However, prompting is another way to do that. And again, back to making the problem smaller. Think of how many ways you might summarize something, right? Like this is an example of how big it could be. What do you include? What do you ignore? Summarizing is the act of abstracting from a list or from content into a kind of a smaller version, or an abstracted version. Okay, well, what do you keep in the abstraction? What do you ignore? What do you throw out? What might you highlight? How do you show it? Are you using bullets, short paragraphs? So there's a lot of things that you're asking the model to do in addition to the fundamental question, which is how do I summarize something? That's where a prompt can really help, is providing, well, let me get to this first. Provide an example of what's important. I just showed you an example as one way to do that, but are you telling it what it should focus on? Are you telling it what it can ignore? Are you telling it what's most important? Are you telling it how you want it to be, the result to be presented? All of this you can pop into a prompt super easily and get a better result. Here again, providing an example for things that are a little more complex, like summarizing, is a great example. You'll hear this sometimes called 1, 2, 3 shot prompting. It's a kind of a nerdy expression from training. And basically it means, 1 example, 2 example, 3 example, that's what they call SHOT. You just upload or provide a URL from a prior example. Again, really useful generally, but also if you're asking for it to do something, I used RFIs as an example before, including an example of an RFI would be a great idea, because then it'll know what to include and what to focus on, and often will give you things in a very copy and pastable format. Just 1 sec, I'm going to look at questions. I think we're going to get to those later. Okay. Problem number 2 is actually, I think, a bigger one. So the making things up, again, we're getting better and better at. The other thing, though, is depending on how long your document is, it may not do it all. What you'll find with retrieval augmented generation is if you just dump documents into ChatGPT and ask it to do things, you're going to find that it doesn't cover everything, that it doesn't include everything. This is something I'd love for everyone to take away, this idea of what we call chain of thought prompting. And basically what you're doing is asking the model to think about the problem. Before it answers anything, before it does anything, you're asking it to do something first. So step 1 would be, I want you to do this. Please break it into steps. Please execute the steps one at a time. And when you do that, again, you're making the problem smaller by breaking it into pieces. Humans do this obviously as well. When we're faced with something that is a little too big for our brains to handle all at once, we'll often break it apart and make it into chapters or make it into steps or whatever it might be. So chain of thought prompting has been used very effectively for years, really, but certainly in the last year or so. And it's a really easy way for you to take a bigger thing you're asking for and break it apart. So an example of this is, and actually I asked, again, to prove my point, I asked ChatGPT to give me an example of a chain of thought prompt. And it came up with this example. How many hours are there in a week? And this is a prompt, by the way. So you say, first calculate how many hours there are in a day. So you're telling it to break the problem apart, and then it goes and does it for you, right? So this is an example of a chain of thought approach, where you're saying, look, I know how to solve this, but I don't want to do the legwork, or I don't want to do the math in this instance. So you're laying out how to do it, and you're as if you were talking to someone who is, again, someone who's right out of school. You're going to do the same thing if somebody's right out of college or just started on the job, whatever the case may be. Very often you're helping them to say, here are the steps I need you to go do. Now go do them and bring it back to me. That's what chain of thought prompting is. So things that you do in your everyday life as a supervisor or a manager very much apply here. The good thing is you don't have to do it verbally. You can actually lay it out in text and kind of edit it a little bit. So so chain of thought with specifics is a way to do that. Kind of a build out of what I just said is, when you've got a document, a long document, this is where this runs into issues. And of course, near and dear to my heart with specifications. A good way to start this is ask the model to index the document. So say, hey, what's in this document? Please create an outline or a table of contents. Then a separate step to check the index to make sure it's all in there. So asking it to go look back and say, did you capture everything? Because often again, it won't. Then step by step, summarize each part of the index. So again, you've broken the problem apart. This is an example of how that chain of thought might work if you're uploading a big document. You do need to know that there will be a limit to what the models can handle, no matter how good your prompt is. But this is going to get you really far. But also provide your context on what a summary should include. So again, you're making the problem smaller. I am going to be a little bit of a dead horse with that one. Kind of what I mentioned a moment ago, a warning about document length is no prompt can get a model to handle more than it can handle. The later models are way better at longer things. In fact, 2 weeks ago, OpenAI kind of fixed an issue with GPT-4 where they called it lazy, which I thought was pretty funny. So classic RAG often only samples sources in the documents, very often long documents, to deal with things like a 3,000 page spec. It's fine tuning, it's prompt engineering, and it's actually how you build the architecture. So just keep in mind that when you're putting something, uploading it into these increasingly capable models, just know that there may be a limit to what it can handle. The truth is most documents most people use most of the time are easily handleable. So this shouldn't really be an issue. Big contracts and so on, it'll be a thing. So here's a quick summary. And again, I start with my main point. Make the problem smaller. Hey, for what it's worth, even in deep learning, making the problem smaller is part of your job. I like to talk about how Google had at least 5,000 models in production. The last time I heard about that was a couple of years ago. Even they will break the problem apart and have multiple models working on the same problem so that they're not asking too much of their AI. So provide context to shrink the process. One way to do that is to make the problem space even smaller. Give examples to guide the model solution. Break the problem into steps. So those are three big ways to do that. The context thing is interesting. For those of you who are familiar with advertising, it's a guy named David Ogilvy, was one of the kind of big, lions of advertising in the last century. He used to say, give me the freedom of a tight brief. And his point was, a really well-crafted question gives you the chance to just work on the question and not fill in the blanks of the question. And that's what we're doing with prompting. So our final thing that we wanted to talk about is creating things. So folks, I'm going to focus way more on text right now, and I'll get into why in a sec, but the net is we know text models are just way better at actual things that you want to use for real business. Images, not so great. Multimodal, not so great. They're getting there, but even some of the examples that I've had as backdrop, you can see that text doesn't work so well when it's in a created image. But so let's start with, what are you using it for? Is it an actual output, or is it an input to your processes? This is an important distinction, because if it's just an input, mediocre results will still give you a starting point, and your prompt maybe doesn't have to be so good. If it's an output, two things are true. One is you're going to still need to iterate and review it, but also you want to have your prompt be, use some of the tools we've talked about before. But I think this is the last time I say make the problem smaller. But the thing is, if you're asking for it to create something for you, not just go find something or summarize things, now it really is an infinite problem unless you make it smaller. So you definitely want to give it the most context of the three use cases we talked about. First thing is, what is it you're asking it to create? Do your best to define what you want. What's a good output and what's a bad output? Often the version of bad output is don't do this or don't include that. Thing I always get wrong is when I ask for an image, I forget to tell it to be widescreen. But also, how long? Is there style? A lot of you have probably heard how people will get songs written in some style or poems written in someone's style. Very good at making stylistic imitations. What's the content? How's it going to be used? What's the role? All that stuff. So, some of the things we want to get at is who's the reader? Who's the writer? So who are the roles that this is for? Where's it appearing? Are there even rules for this? So this gets us to an actual framework. So far I've given you some ideas. I've given you, whether it's, providing context, whether it's giving examples, whether it's some of the other the chain of thought. RICE is what this framework is called. And it's really nice because it encapsulates everything I've said so far. So first thing is, what's the role of the writer? So say something like, you are a construction PM and you're writing an RFI. So that's the instruction. Now, the instruction is actually where a lot of the meat's going to be. So so that I could fit this on one slide, I didn't put all the instructions in here. But if you think about it, what you're going to want to do is say, who's doing this? So I can narrow down what they would care about. Then what's the instruction? What am I actually asking you to do? What's the context? So what's it for? Where's it going to be? So on and so forth. Separate from that, what are its constraints? How long do I want this to be? Is there a form to be used? Is there something else to know? And the final one that we've talked about is examples. So you can cut and paste if you've got it somewhere else, upload a sample, use a URL depending on what the URL is. But the point in all of this is using the RICE framework. It's just an easy way for you to keep in mind the different parts of a prompt that we're going to give you a better answer. And this is absolutely most relevant when you're creating something new. Some of this stuff is a little less critical when you're asking it to summarize and so on. That's why I bring it up here. The fun part here is back to my point earlier, you don't have to do this on your own from scratch. Instructions you do, but the role, the instructions, context, and so on, you can pop in some bullets and have ChatGPT do it for you, which is what I actually did. I reformatted this so it's a little easier to read. But a lot of this actual text came from ChatGPT. I put in some of the details. Obviously, you want to read it and make sure it's right. But nevertheless, the point here is if you know the RICE framework, you just pop in some bullets under each of these and say, write me an effective prompt based on these details, and it'll do it for you. So this is an example of, hang on a minute, did I put the right thing in? I used RICE for this. Sorry, I actually cut and paste the wrong thing. But with and without it, you can see this is, I'm sorry, that's right. This is a simple quote, a simple prompt. This is me. You can't see it here because I couldn't get it all in one screen. But when I used RICE, you get much better information. You get better quality overall. Now it's the same really good model, so it might maybe not so obvious. But the difference is, as you read through this, it's more complete, it's better written, and it's more useful. So to kind of, we've talked about text mostly the whole time. I really have less to say about images for a couple of reasons. All of the above prompts, make some sense. Obviously, you're not talking about summarizing quite so much, but knowing the role, knowing who it's for, and so on. Definitely expect to iterate. Right now, I find that the image generation is nice for a cute image or a PowerPoint backdrop, but it's not ready for prime time. Examples are going to help too. I frankly, the examples are a little bit catch as catch can. There are ways of prompting for images a little better than what I've said here, but frankly, I just think most of us aren't doing that very much because again, they're not ready for prime time. And what's interesting about multimodal content is, honestly, I wouldn't spend a lot of time here. I find over and over again that images screw up the text. In fact, if you look at the cover of this document, you know what? I'll just do it for giggles. I did this with DALL-E, and you can see. Let me make it larger. You can see that it couldn't write. Like, this is in English in there, even though I gave it the words. It's really bad at being multimodal. So for the moment, I think that's obviously going to change, and it's something they're working on. But it's worth keeping in mind that right now it's still an area for improvement. So we're getting towards the end. We're going to be able to do some Q&A in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about something you might have heard of called prompt engineering. So the way to think about prompt engineering, and this is honestly beyond what I think most people on this call will spend time with, but it's how are you making it so that you've really systematically figured out how to test different prompts. For an individual like the folks, like most of us, I would encourage you to go and try out customized ChatGPT in the settings. So it looks like this. You can give it custom instructions. You can tell it how to respond. So this is where your context comes in. This is where your role comes in. This is where you would put some of your constraints. And I think that you can test this over and over again so that it's beginning to give you the sorts of answers you want. I would think about something that you do a lot, like write me an email, and just pop in here and try it more and more. That is the way that kind of individuals use prompt engineering. The other thing you can do, though, is create a simple test matrix. So for those of you who've done this sort of thing, this is literally a simple text matrix. And if you're going to do this professionally, you're going to do this at your company, there are tools that don't automate but make this easier. But you can say, what was the prompt? What was the result? What didn't it get right? What's it missing? What should we do to make it better? Then you test it again here. And you just iterate through that until you're getting where you want. Again, this will be really useful next month when we talk about automations, where you might want to put a static prompt that it does every time something happens. So you're going to want to spend the time to test and really review it. So let me summarize some takeaways here. It's helpful to think of generative AI. Look, probabilistic is a lovely word. Thinking of it as a cognitive system is maybe a little more helpful. They're fundamentally different to other software. So they're going to need more context supplied by you, but they can do pretty amazing things. They can accept a much wider question type, but they need to be given a fuller brief versus a simple question. Get used to questioning your own assumptions that are baked into a question. So the bad prompt examples are examples of how people would normally talk because they know a human will fill in the gaps, but you're going to get a bad answer from generative AI because it won't make those assumptions. But also get used to asking generative AI for help in using generative AI. Chatbots are amazing at writing prompts, among other things. But always, always make the problem as small as possible, but not smaller. In practice, you're going to find real products that come with their own focus, with preloaded prompts and documents that they're referencing. So that's, it's not a tabula rasa. So make sure you're not asking a question no human would answer. So point one is a lot of them will come loaded to make the problem smaller for you. But also back to the point I made a moment ago, make sure you're not asking a question a human couldn't answer. So are you asking about an absence? That's really an expertise question, not a content question. Asking it too high a level, like how can you spell the word to? Are you summarizing concrete requirements as an example? Like, okay, how do you summarize? What do we mean by that? Are we assuming asking with missing definitions? The final point here, chat implies that back and forth I mentioned before. So always feel free to ask clarifying questions, sort of like, did it get it all? Or were those questions right? Or, do you have a source for those answers? And so on. So we're going to get into Q&A now. We got about 10 minutes left. So what I'd encourage you to do, check out SpecGPT, our specifications copilot. I'm happy to help anyone on the call. Connect with me to talk about what you're doing. I'm really excited about what's going on in this industry. And the more we're talking to each other, the more we're learning from each other and really getting to practical use as opposed to abstract discussions. That's kind of what I try to do in these talks, is actual things that you can do something with. And then I guess the final point, of course, is next month, we're going to talk about how to put some of this to work for you personally. So connecting prompts to ChatGPT, to email, and some other things. There's some amazing tools out there where we'll talk a lot about Zapier. We'll talk about some others that kind of do most of the work for you. So it's pretty cool. So with that, I'm going to go through some questions. Feel free to unmute yourselves, but let me go through some of the questions that we've got in here. It's 100 things saying people joined. While I do that, does anyone have any questions?
I have a quick question. There's so many different AI platforms out there. There's just, an enormous amount. Which one do you recommend really using?
For the moment, I'm still using ChatGPT and OpenAI. I haven't really used Claude. Is another easy one for you to jump into. What do you want it for? Like, I think the question is, what do you think you're going to use in the short run? A lot of it, I think, I would pay for GPT Plus because it's $20 and you just get better answers. But I think that's already really, really good and a good place to start. But are there specific things that you're looking to do that might, make the problem smaller?
I want it to write scope of work eventually. I want it to do contracts for me. I'd like it to dang near do almost anything I can do. Just do it quicker and more efficiently.
So I think that's where the problem size and document size might start to be a thing, where the model alone, it's like a generic model, for lack of a better word, because it's not tuned to contracts or scopes of work and all that. You might run into a little bit of trouble. One way of looking at that is upload an existing the best you can do from an existing example, and then in your prompt, break apart. So I'm getting back to I'm not really answering your question about the best model, but I think GPT-4 is probably going to be as good as any other at handling this. But what you'd want to do is upload an example and then have it read the example, break it apart, and then in your prompt, give it maybe go step by step to have it create the elements of the scope, if that makes sense, instead of one big, give me an output. Does that make sense?
Right. The idea of indexing, having them index it, that's really smart. I hadn't thought about that. So I really appreciate that. That's going to be very helpful because I can put the specs in there and have them pull the scope of work together and just kind of tweak it as I go.
I think doing it on your own, even step by step, depending on it really depends on your own workflow and what you're trying to do faster. But yeah, I think to the degree you're giving it the ability to do it, that chain of thought prompting is really what we're talking about, plus the example. And actually, there's more stuff out there about chain of thought if you want to really dig into it. There's nice tutorials on it on YouTube and so on. Any other thoughts or questions?
I
I'm sorry.
appreciate
Go ahead.
doing this. It's been really helpful.
My pleasure. Is there a number of questions about recording for folks that probably join later? Absolutely. I'll make this recording available on YouTube as early as tomorrow. Monty mentioned that he's been using Edge's Copilot. Monty, do you mind jumping in and saying how your experience has been? Forgive me if I'm
sure.
I hope I got your name right.
Yeah, it's pronounced with a Spanish accent, but you were close enough. It's Monty.
Okay.
But yeah, it's been honestly really fun to just play with the free version of Microsoft Edge's Copilot. It's a really simple download. I use a MacBook, so I was surprised even to like find myself playing with a Microsoft product. But yeah, it's been great, honestly, just to get familiar with it, to start practicing, like you said, the just getting better at asking the right questions.
And I think I got it on my phone too. I believe that's another example of model aside. They've done some things, and I'm blanking a little bit on it, but they've done some things to help you. Like the way they productized it, there's some interesting things in there as well. I think there's some memory, there's some other parts. So the other point, I'm really glad you brought that up. So for folks that are interested in just playing around with this a little bit, it's free too, right? Like you can go on the App Store and yeah. I encourage you to check that out too. There's been a joke that it's GPT-4 for free, which I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it's probably not far off. But what's interesting is how they're bringing it to market, and so is OpenAI. So like OpenAI, you can you can upload documents now. You can point it at URLs. You can actually have it call APIs if you know how to do that. So it's interesting that they're all starting to surround the model with more and more ways to make it useful. And I think I remember that I noted that Microsoft had done some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah,
That's
and
great.
I also would say that a friend of mine who's been using ChatGPT, we kind of were playing around with them at the same time, and we were trying to get a summary from a YouTube video, and I'm not sure if it's because of the way that they had their ChatGPT set up, but we found that Microsoft Copilot did a much better job of summarizing the video. All I did was share the YouTube link, and it just instantly gave me like a nice little breakdown and even time stamped of what was happening in the video. So yeah, for some things we've noticed that it's a bit better than ChatGPT, but again, just depends, I think, on how you have it set up. But I haven't really done a whole lot of setup on Copilot. There are some options for like having more creative responses if you want to do like artistic stuff versus,
yeah.
So it's cool.
There's a thing behind the scenes that you I don't know how to get at it when you're not using it as an API. They call it temperature. So when the model can go really, really tight in terms of just being really strictly reporting on what you gave it, or you can have the temperature, I think, higher, means more creative. And depending on what you want the output to be, that can be good or bad. So your point about more and less creative, like you'll hear people and engineers talk about that as temperature. I haven't seen that called that on a kind of consumer facing side. So Paul mentioned that GPT with agents does a really good job with transcripts. I think what you pointed out, Monty, hopefully I got better, is that the way it gets productized is they're going to put things in there to make it better at one thing or another. You know what I mean? Whether it's they've fine-tuned it, or I don't know. There's different ways to do it, which is really cool. Peter, go ahead.
Hey, Hugh, can you hear me?
Hey, I can.
Just a question about kind of reading PDFs. I mean, one of the exciting kind of frontiers that I can kind of think of is, for AI to understand engineering drawings, and you're obviously working on specifications, but, can you share a little bit about what in terms of what's coming down the pipes for reading PDFs, understanding PDFs, kind of, more on the drawing side of things rather than the language and specification side of things?
Yeah, I think the drawing is easier and harder. I think that frankly, I think you're going to have drawings that are model outputs be more reliable than others. And I say that because, and I'm speaking a little bit above my skis here. What I've heard from people that are doing that, and this is, there's some pretty good product out there, but the drawings themselves can really be a problem in that there's a lot of variability, and it's not so easy always for a model to know what it's looking at. So I think there still needs to be a human in the loop. Today, we didn't talk about human in the loop so much. I've kind of talked about iterative and, whether it's for, your own input or an output. I think for a while, at least, that's going to be, I actually think the way we draw is going to change while the rest of this evolution is happening, so that the drawings are a little bit more clear. It's easy to say that, but I have a feeling that various technologies will make that true. Specs, we run into the same thing though, is if it's coming from an HOK or a Gensler, the specs are beautiful and they're easy for a computer to read. If they're coming from, a small architect or a sub that's, this is the 15th time they've copy pasted and changed the details of an old document, less so. And so we run into some things that are hard for anyone to read. And that's just on the spec side. So to answer your question, I think that it's going to continue to get better and better. The underlying reality of the documents are a limit because they're just messy out in the real world. And I think that's just, there's always going to be a little bit of a limit, because even a human would have to make a judgment call on what something is, because it's just not that clear cut. The more we do this, the better the computers are, or the better the models are going to be at making those judgment calls. But I think, we talk in abstract about what AI does, but we all know the practical reality of construction documents is they can be really messy. They can have a lot of notes on them and so on and so forth. So the models are really good when it's clean and well formatted. They're still pretty good when things are a little messy, but when it's a real mess, they can need a little bit of help. So hopefully that answers that. I don't have a great answer about when it's all going to be solved. What I would say is it's going to keep getting better. And I know that professional use of image models or enterprise use of image models is something a lot of folks are looking at and trying to make better. Dennis, by all means, you want to talk about you said you're using paid version of ChatGPT and Copilot. You mentioned in your note, you can share some. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. Hey, Hugh. How you doing?
Great.
Yeah, so we're doing a couple of different things. So primarily, we have the paid version set up for our application development team. We're a general contractor, and we do a lot of internal application development. So we got the ChatGPT Teams account for pretty much now most of our development team, and they're kind of using it as paired programming. So as they go in, they write applications instead of going to Google or Stack Overflow to look something up. It's kind of just in line right there in their toolkit where they're interacting with ChatGPT, and it's either answering questions or providing examples, or hey, I'm trying to do this, can you get me started? And it's getting them 80-90% there. It's working great for them. The feedback has been super positive with it.
Dennis, can I stop you for 1 sec? For
Yeah.
those of you who still on, this idea of pair programming is one of the best ways I've heard contractors using in real production, not just playing around and writing emails. Pair programming, we don't have time to get into it too deeply, but it really makes a small team a lot more productive and a lot more efficient, because it does things not just suggesting code, but it'll debug, it'll do all the tedium that people don't love, like documenting.
Totally cuts down so much time people trying to look stuff up.
So that's a good thing for folks outside of this conversation to look up. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, no problem. And we have some technologies that aren't necessarily super mainstream. So even some of these niche programming languages, we actually found people that have written chat GPTs that we've used to, help us solve a few technical issues with. So so far it's been pretty good. We also signed up for the OpenAI API, and we've connected it to our accounting and ERP system. But I'm not going to name the system, but we are experimenting with that. Very, very much early in a beta test with it. It'll be interesting to see how we do with it. We've also taken all the documentation from the accounting system, and we've created our own GPT. Now, right now, we didn't train it, so it's kind of dumb, and the answers that it gives you aren't the greatest. But we plan on trying to refine that as we move forward. The other thing that we did is we have a couple of power users. So we have multiple divisions, and we have like a technology lead within each of those divisions. And the one gentleman for our paving company, he's really sharp, but he's not a programmer. He's a project manager, project executive. So he's taking GPS data out of our fleet of equipment, and he's working with the end users to try to visualize that data. So instead of him trying to write a whole bunch of macros in Excel of, downloading this info and creating these charts and graphs, he basically started having an interaction with ChatGPT of what he wanted to do, kept iterating on the examples, basically had it write him a Python script so whenever he downloads this file, it does all the conversion now. It puts it in the format that he wants. He builds the charts that he wants in Excel, and he's giving that back to the end users. And then eventually what he wants to do is get the feedback from the end users. Hey, is this what you want? Before he approaches us with the application development team to actually build that out for him in some existing applications that we have. So like now we have a guy who's not a programmer, power user, knows the business, working with his team. So when he comes to us, there's going to be a much clearer example of what they want. I mean, they can almost effectively hand us here and say, here, integrate this into our existing applications we're using.
Love that. And it just speaks to how the more people work with it, the more they're finding ways that it just adds value here or helps automate a step there. Really cool. Thank you for that, Dennis.
Yeah. And just super quickly, so we just got started with Copilot. Initial impressions out of the chute, not impressed. It's kind of inline, built in for Word. I don't find it to be any different than, let's say, a Grammarly to help you with anything. And then the feedback I've gotten from some of the people that we're trying out with PowerPoint, Excel, it's pretty much worthless for right now. They didn't really find it very useful yet.
That's good advice or good feedback. Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
So folks, we're a little bit over. Are there any final questions? If not, this is going to be, as I say, posted on LinkedIn for sure. Reach out to me through LinkedIn if you don't see it, and I'm happy to shoot you over the link. No pun intended. Thank you all.